Imagine stepping aboard a Navy ship, ready to serve your country, only to become an unwitting test subject in one of the most secretive and disturbing military experiments in American history. Between 1962 and 1974, thousands of American servicemen became guinea pigs in a covert program that would remain hidden for decades. They were never told the truth. They were never asked for consent. And when they got sick, their government denied everything. This is the story of Project SHAD, the secret chemical and biological warfare tests conducted on United States sailors, and one of the darkest chapters in American military history. Project SHAD stands for Shipboard Hazard and Defense. The name sounds bureaucratic, almost boring, but behind those three words lies a program that betrayed the trust of the men who volunteered to defend America. These weren't criminals. They weren't prisoners of war. They were young American sailors, Marines, and soldiers who believed they were conducting routine military exercises. Instead, they were exposed to deadly nerve agents, biological toxins, and chemical weapons without their knowledge or consent. The story begins in the early 1960s, during the height of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a terrifying standoff, each side developing increasingly sophisticated weapons. Nuclear war was a constant threat, but military strategists were also deeply concerned about chemical and biological warfare. The question that haunted the Pentagon was simple but chilling. If an enemy attacked American forces with biological or chemical weapons, would our troops be able to defend themselves? Would our ships survive? Would our detection systems work? To answer these questions, the Department of Defense created a program that would test the vulnerability of Navy ships and personnel to these deadly agents. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. The military decided that the only way to truly test these defenses was to conduct real-world experiments using actual chemical and biological agents. They needed to spray ships with nerve gas. They needed to release bacteria into the air around vessels at sea. They needed to see how quickly these agents would spread, how deadly they would be, and whether protective equipment would actually work. And they needed human subjects to make the tests realistic. So they used their own sailors, without telling them what was really happening. The tests were conducted under a larger program called Project 112, which included both land-based and sea-based experiments. Project SHAD was the maritime component, focusing specifically on Navy vessels. Between 1962 and 1974, dozens of tests were conducted in various locations around the world, including the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii, the Atlantic Ocean, and even off the coast of Alaska. The ships involved ranged from destroyers to aircraft carriers, and the number of personnel potentially exposed is estimated to be in the thousands, though the exact number remains classified even today. Let me tell you about some of these tests, because the details are truly shocking. In one series of experiments called Flower Drum, conducted in 1964, the Navy deliberately contaminated ships with two types of bacteria, one of which was later found to cause serious infections in humans. Sailors aboard these vessels had no idea they were being exposed. They went about their normal duties, sleeping in their bunks, eating in the mess hall, breathing air that had been deliberately contaminated with potentially deadly organisms. Another test series, called Shady Grove, involved spraying ships with the nerve agent VX, one of the most toxic substances ever created. VX is so deadly that a single drop on the skin can kill an adult human within minutes. The military wanted to see how well decontamination procedures would work if a ship was attacked with this agent. So they sprayed it on deck surfaces, on equipment, on the very places where sailors would be working. Some sailors were told they were participating in tests of protective gear. Others were told nothing at all. None of them were told they were being exposed to actual nerve agents. The test, called Autumn Gold, involved the release of biological simulants, substances that were supposed to mimic the behavior of actual biowarfare agents, but were claimed to be harmless. Except they weren't always harmless. One of the bacteria used, Serratia marcescens, was later linked to serious infections, and there's evidence that it may have caused illness and even deaths in some cases. The military chose this bacteria specifically because it was easy to detect and track, but they ignored or downplayed warnings that it could be dangerous to humans. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the secrecy. These tests were classified at the highest levels. The sailors involved were often told they were participating in routine training exercises or tests of equipment. Many signed secrecy agreements without understanding what they were agreeing to keep secret. Officers overseeing the tests were ordered not to discuss them, even with other military personnel. Medical records were altered or made to disappear. When sailors began to get sick, their illnesses were attributed to other causes, and their requests for information were denied. The testing methodology was elaborate and carefully planned. Ships would be positioned in specific formations. Weather conditions would be monitored to ensure optimal dispersal of the agents. Monitoring equipment would be set up to measure how far and how fast the chemicals or bacteria would spread. And then, without warning to most of the crew, the agents would be released. Sometimes they were sprayed from aircraft flying overhead. Sometimes they were released from special generators placed on the ships themselves. In some tests, entire clouds of contaminated air would drift over vessels, enveloping them in invisible poisons. The men conducting these experiments kept detailed records. They measured wind speed and direction. They calculated how much of the agent reached which parts of the ship. They tracked how long the contamination persisted. What they didn't do was track the long-term health effects on the sailors who were exposed. There was no follow-up, no medical monitoring, no effort to see if these men developed cancers, respiratory diseases, neurological disorders, or other health problems in the years and decades after their exposure. For years, decades even, the veterans who had been part of these tests had no idea what had happened to them. They knew they had participated in some kind of unusual exercises. Some remembered being told to wear gas masks or protective gear. Others remembered strange smells, unusual procedures, or being ordered to areas of the ship they normally wouldn't go. But they didn't know they had been exposed to nerve agents and biological weapons. When they got sick, when they developed cancers or respiratory problems or neurological conditions, they had no way to connect these illnesses to their military service. The wall of secrecy began to crack in the late 1990s. Investigative journalists started asking questions about old military experiments. Veterans groups began comparing notes, realizing that many men who had served on certain ships during certain periods were getting sick with similar conditions. A few brave veterans who had been involved in the tests began to speak out, despite the secrecy agreements they had signed decades earlier. They knew they were risking legal consequences, but they felt a duty to warn their fellow sailors and to seek answers. In 2000, under pressure from Congress and veterans groups, the Department of Defense finally admitted that Project SHAD had existed. They released some information, but it was incomplete and heavily redacted. They claimed that most of the agents used were harmless simulants, and that actual nerve agents had only been used in a few tests. They said that protective measures had been in place, and that no one had been seriously harmed. Veterans who had been there knew this wasn't the whole truth. The Department of Defense established a declassification effort, promising to release information about all the Project SHAD tests. But the process was painfully slow. Documents were released in dribs and drabs, often with key information blacked out. The names of ships were revealed, but not always the dates of the tests. The types of agents were mentioned, but not always the quantities or concentrations. Veterans trying to find out if they had been exposed faced a bureaucratic maze, often waiting years for answers. Even when information was released, it often contradicted what veterans remembered. The military claimed certain tests had used only harmless simulants, while sailors who were there remembered being told to wear full protective gear and seeing men get sick immediately after the tests. The Pentagon insisted that all safety protocols had been followed, but veterans remembered lax procedures, broken equipment, and officers who seemed unconcerned about exposure risks. Let me share some of the personal stories, because statistics and test names don't capture the human cost of Project SHAD. Frank Rochelle was a young sailor aboard the USS George Eastman during tests in the Pacific. He remembered the day everything changed. An announcement came over the ship's speakers, ordering all hands to specific stations. Then a plane flew overhead, and he saw a mist settling over the ship. Within hours, several crew members were sick. Years later, Frank developed multiple cancers and a respiratory condition that made breathing difficult. When he tried to get information from the military about what he had been exposed to, he was told there were no records of any unusual activities aboard his ship during his service. Paul Townsend was aboard the USS Granville S. Hall during autumn gold tests. He was a healthy young man when he enlisted, but after the tests, he began experiencing strange symptoms. His skin would break out in rashes. He had trouble breathing. He suffered from chronic fatigue that doctors couldn't explain. Over the years, the symptoms got worse, and he developed a rare form of cancer. It wasn't until the Department of Defense finally released information about Project SHAD that Paul realized his ship had been part of the biological agent tests. By then, he had been fighting for disability benefits for over 30 years, with the VA repeatedly denying his claims because he couldn't prove his illnesses were service-connected. Ken Campbell served on the USS Independence during tests off the coast of Hawaii. He remembered being ordered below deck while something was happening topside. He remembered strange smells when they were finally allowed back up. He remembered several crew members getting sick in the days that followed. Ken himself seemed fine at first, but years later he developed Parkinson's disease, a progressive neurological condition. When information about Project SHAD came out, Ken learned that the Independence had been part of tests involving nerve agents. Nerve agents are known to cause neurological damage. But when Ken applied for VA benefits, his claim was denied because the military said there was insufficient evidence he had actually been exposed to the agents, despite the fact that he was on the ship during the tests. These stories repeat themselves hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Veterans getting sick with cancers, respiratory diseases, neurological conditions, immune system disorders. Veterans being denied benefits because they can't prove exposure. Veterans dying before they ever learn the truth about what happened to them. Families left with questions that may never be answered. The legal and ethical implications of Project SHAD are staggering. Under the Nuremberg Code, established after World War II in response to Nazi medical experiments, human experimentation requires informed consent. The test subjects must be told what the experiment involves, what the risks are, and they must voluntarily agree to participate. Project SHAD violated every one of these principles. Sailors were not informed about the true nature of the tests. They were not told about the risks. They were not given a choice to participate or not. This wasn't just unethical. Under international law and military regulations, it was illegal. The military's defense has been that the tests were necessary for national security and that they believed the risks were minimal. They argue that the agents were used in controlled conditions and that they took precautions to protect personnel. But this argument falls apart when you look at the facts. First, the agents used were not always as safe as claimed. Bacteria that the military called harmless simulants have been shown to cause serious infections and illnesses. Second, the protective measures were often inadequate or not used at all. Many sailors were exposed without any protective gear whatsoever. Third, even if the immediate risks were thought to be low, there was no long-term follow-up to monitor health effects, which suggests the military wasn't really concerned about the welfare of the men they were using as test subjects. Some defenders of the program point out that this was the Cold War, a time of genuine existential threat to the United States. They argue that the military needed to understand how to defend against chemical and biological attacks, and that some risks were justified in the name of national defense. But there were alternatives. The military could have used genuine volunteers who were fully informed about the risks. They could have conducted the tests with better safety protocols. They could have at least monitored the health of the men they exposed, so that if problems emerged, they could be treated. Instead, they chose secrecy, deception, and negligence. The parallels to other unethical medical experiments are impossible to ignore. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where the U.S. Public Health Service deliberately withheld treatment from black men with syphilis to study the progression of the disease. The plutonium injection experiments, where patients were injected with radioactive plutonium without their knowledge or consent. The CIA's MKUltra program, which involved testing LSD and other drugs on unwitting subjects. Project SHAD fits into this disturbing pattern of the U.S. government using its own citizens as guinea pigs in the name of national security or scientific research. What makes Project SHAD particularly troubling is that it targeted military personnel, the very people who had volunteered to serve their country. These men had already agreed to put their lives at risk in combat. They had signed up to defend America. In return, they had every right to expect that their government would treat them with basic respect and dignity, that they would not be used as experimental subjects without their knowledge. That trust was betrayed. The Department of Defense has apologized for Project SHAD, sort of. In official statements, they have acknowledged that the tests happened and that some information was kept from the participants. But they have stopped short of a full, unqualified apology. They have not acknowledged that the tests were illegal under both military regulations and international law. They have not admitted that they knowingly put men at risk. They have not taken full responsibility for the health consequences that many veterans have suffered. More importantly, the government has been slow to help the veterans affected by these tests. Getting information remains difficult. Many veterans still don't know if they were exposed or to what they were exposed. The VA disability system has been unsympathetic, often requiring levels of proof that are impossible for veterans to provide, especially when the military itself destroyed or classified many of the relevant records. Some progress has been made. Congress has held hearings. Some records have been declassified. Some veterans have received disability compensation. But for many, it's too little too late. The scientific value of Project SHAD is questionable at best. Yes, the tests provided data about how chemical and biological agents behave in maritime environments. They showed how quickly these agents could spread on a ship and how difficult they could be to detect and decontaminate. But much of this information could have been obtained through other means, using simulants that were genuinely safe, or conducting tests in controlled laboratory environments, or using fully informed volunteers with proper medical monitoring. The decision to conduct these tests in the manner they did was driven more by convenience and the culture of military secrecy than by genuine scientific necessity. It's also worth noting that the defensive measures developed as a result of Project SHAD have been of limited practical value. The United States has never faced a major chemical or biological attack on its naval forces. The scenarios that Project SHAD was designed to prepare for, massive Soviet attacks on Navy ships with chemical or biological weapons, never materialized. Meanwhile, the real costs of the program have been borne by the veterans who were exposed and who have lived with the health consequences for decades. The legacy of Project SHAD extends beyond the direct victims. It has contributed to a deep distrust of the military and government among veterans and their families. When you know that the government was willing to secretly expose sailors to nerve agents and deadly bacteria, it's hard to trust official assurances about anything. This distrust has had real consequences, making veterans less likely to participate in legitimate medical research, less likely to trust VA doctors, and less likely to believe official explanations for illnesses related to military service. We see this legacy playing out in other contexts. When veterans of the Gulf War began experiencing mysterious illnesses, they were initially dismissed, and it took years of advocacy before Gulf War syndrome was officially recognized. When veterans returned from Iraq and Afghanistan with respiratory problems from exposure to burn pits, the VA was slow to acknowledge the connection. In each case, veterans and their advocates pointed to Project SHAD and other past betrayals as reasons to be skeptical of official denials. The Project SHAD story also raises broader questions about government secrecy and accountability. These tests remained classified for decades. The men who were exposed had no way to find out what had happened to them. Even after the program was revealed, getting complete information has been nearly impossible. This level of secrecy might be justified for genuine national security secrets, like the design of weapons or the details of military operations. But using secrecy to hide unethical experimentation on American service members is not about protecting the country. It's about protecting the people who made the decision to conduct these tests from accountability. Today, there are regulations designed to prevent this kind of abuse. The Department of Defense has strict rules about human experimentation, requiring informed consent and ethical review. But these rules only exist because of scandals like Project SHAD. And even with these rules in place, we have to ask whether they would actually prevent a similar program if military leaders decided it was necessary for national security. The culture of secrecy in the military and intelligence agencies remains strong. The tendency to prioritize the mission over the welfare of individual service members remains a concern. For the veterans of Project SHAD who are still alive, the fight continues. They're fighting for recognition, for medical care, for disability benefits, and for the truth. Many are now in their 70s or 80s, and time is running out. Each year, more of them die, taking their stories and their memories with them. Some have never received acknowledgement that they were part of these tests. Others have received acknowledgement, but been denied benefits because they can't prove their illnesses are connected to their exposure. Still others are trying to get medical conditions added to the list of presumptive illnesses related to Project SHAD exposure. Veterans advocacy groups have been crucial in this fight. Organizations like the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, and smaller groups specifically focused on Project SHAD have pushed for declassification of records, for medical research into the health effects of the agents used, and for presumptive disability benefits for exposed veterans. They've lobbied Congress, organized letter-writing campaigns, and provided support to individual veterans navigating the VA system. Without these groups, many veterans would never have learned they were part of Project SHAD at all. Congress has held multiple hearings on Project SHAD over the years. Lawmakers have expressed outrage and demanded answers from the Department of Defense. Some legislation has been passed to help exposed veterans. But there's been no comprehensive solution, no full accounting of what happened, and no guarantee that similar abuses couldn't happen again. The military's institutional interests in protecting its reputation and avoiding liability have often trumped the interests of the individual veterans who were harmed. The medical research into the long-term health effects of exposure to the agents used in Project SHAD has been limited. Some studies have been done, but they've been hampered by incomplete records and the difficulty of tracking down veterans who were exposed decades ago. What research has been done suggests that exposure to the nerve agents and biological agents used in these tests can lead to increased rates of cancer, respiratory disease, and neurological conditions. But much more research is needed, and it needs to be done quickly, while exposed veterans are still alive to participate. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Project SHAD story is how preventable it was. If the military had conducted these tests with informed consent, with proper safety protocols, and with long-term medical monitoring, much of the harm could have been avoided. Veterans who developed illnesses could have been treated earlier. Connections between exposure and disease could have been established sooner. And the military would have avoided the scandal and loss of trust that has resulted from the revelation of these secret tests. The question of compensation is complicated. How do you compensate someone for being used as an unwitting test subject? How do you put a price on the years of illness, the pain, the medical bills, the lost time with family? Some veterans have received disability payments from the VA, but these payments are often inadequate and came only after years of fighting. There have been no direct compensation payments from the Department of Defense specifically for Project SHAD exposure. Some veterans have considered lawsuits, but the legal barriers are formidable. The government has broad immunity from lawsuits related to military service, and proving causation decades after exposure is extremely difficult. For the families of veterans who have died, the pain is compounded by unanswered questions. They know their loved one served his country. They watched him suffer from illnesses that the government denied were service-related. They saw him die without ever receiving acknowledgement or help. And they're left wondering if things could have been different, if he had been told the truth, if he had received proper medical care, if the government had taken responsibility sooner. The story of Project SHAD is also a reminder of the power imbalance inherent in military service. When you enlist, you agree to follow orders. You agree to go where you're sent and do what you're told. This system is necessary for military effectiveness, but it also creates opportunities for abuse. Sailors ordered to participate in Project SHAD tests couldn't refuse. They couldn't demand to know what was really happening. They couldn't opt out. They were completely at the mercy of their commanding officers and the military hierarchy above them. This power imbalance is why the ethical and legal protections for human subjects of research are so important. They exist precisely to protect people who are in vulnerable positions, whether that's military personnel, prisoners, patients, or others who might not be able to freely refuse to participate. Project SHAD violated these protections, and the consequences have been devastating for the men who were exposed and their families. As we look back on Project SHAD more than 50 years after the last tests were conducted, we have to ask what lessons we've learned. Have we truly internalized the ethical principles that should govern military research? Have we created systems that would prevent similar abuses? Have we done right by the veterans who were harmed? The answers to these questions are mixed at best. On the positive side, there is more awareness today of the history of unethical military experimentation. Medical ethics are taught more rigorously in military medical training. There are more oversight mechanisms. Whistleblower protections are stronger, though still imperfect. The culture has shifted somewhat toward recognizing that service members have rights even within the hierarchical structure of the military. But challenges remain. The culture of secrecy in the military remains strong. When current operations or experiments are classified, how can we be sure they're being conducted ethically? When veterans report unusual illnesses after deployments, are we listening to them and investigating thoroughly, or are we too quick to dismiss their concerns? Are we providing adequate medical care and disability benefits to veterans dealing with the consequences of toxic exposures, whether from Project SHAD or from burn pits or other hazards. The Project SHAD veterans deserve more than they've received. They deserve full disclosure of what they were exposed to. They deserve comprehensive medical care for conditions related to their exposure. They deserve disability compensation without having to fight for years to prove what the government already knows. They deserve an unqualified apology, not just for the tests themselves, but for the decades of denial and cover-up that followed. And they deserve the assurance that their service and their sacrifice, both the voluntary sacrifice of military service and the involuntary sacrifice of being used as test subjects, will be remembered and honored. For those of us who were not part of Project SHAD, the story should inspire both gratitude and vigilance. Gratitude for the men who served, who trusted their government, and who paid a price for that trust. And vigilance to ensure that such abuses never happen again, that we hold our government and military accountable, and that we never forget what happened when secrecy and institutional interests were prioritized over the welfare of individual service members. The final chapter of the Project SHAD story has not yet been written. There are still veterans fighting for recognition and benefits. There are still families seeking answers. There are still documents that remain classified. There are still unanswered questions about the full extent of the tests and the number of people who were exposed. As time passes, the window for justice and accountability grows smaller. But as long as there are veterans still alive who were part of Project SHAD, as long as their families continue to seek the truth, the story continues. Project SHAD represents a betrayal of the fundamental covenant between a nation and those who serve it. When men and women join the military, they're promised that while they may be asked to risk their lives in combat, they will be treated with dignity and respect. They will be given the best equipment and training. They will be cared for if they're injured. And they will be told the truth about the dangers they face. Project SHAD violated all of these promises. It used American sailors as guinea pigs. It exposed them to deadly agents without their knowledge. It denied them medical care when they got sick. And it covered up the truth for decades. As we remember Project SHAD today, we honor the veterans who were subjected to these experiments. We acknowledge their service and their suffering. We commit to continuing the fight for truth, accountability, and justice. And we resolve that the lessons of Project SHAD must never be forgotten, so that no future generation of service members will ever be treated as expendable in the name of military research. This is the story of Project SHAD, a dark chapter in American military history, a betrayal of trust, and a reminder that vigilance and accountability are essential to preserving the rights and dignity of those who serve. The men who were part of Project SHAD were heroes who volunteered to defend America. They deserved better then, and they deserve better now. May we never forget their sacrifice, and may we never stop fighting for the truth and justice they have earned.